killed her or that he was even in the house. And there's no evidence of any DNA or fingerprints that they have that points to him or to anybody else. So there actually are no suspects, according to the authorities, because they say it's a suicide. So according to the Zahaus, however, they believe Adam Shacknai did this. But the problem is it's civil court. And the finding that he was responsible for Rebecca's death was in civil court and not in criminal court. So this has not met the higher threshold for criminality. And that's why it hasn't been a criminal case again, because they don't have evidence that points to anybody. There's no forensic evidence in terms of fingerprints or DNA or somebody's clothing or anything like that, that they could say we have another suspect or someone else was there. So that's one of the main problems with this case in terms of being considered a murder. That's what the sheriff kept saying is there's all these theories, but there's just no evidence, and we have to think about science. So you think about how this country has been going. We have this huge divide in this country today about people who believe in science. They don't think COVID is a hoax, and they want to get vaccinated. There's a whole other huge portion of the population that still thinks it's a hoax, that doesn't want to get vaccinated, that thinks that the vaccine is going to give you COVID because it has the spike protein in it. They don't even understand what it is. So my point is, this thing about forensic evidence, they have to be able to prove that somebody else was there, and they don't have that. Now, that's not to say that somebody else wasn't there and that the investigation was not complete enough. There are people who believe that, and that maybe they just didn't find the forensic evidence. But at this point, that's why it hasn't gone to criminal court, because they don't have that forensic evidence that points to anybody else.
You really made me stop and think in the book when you talked about her DNA was all over the place, but nobody else was. And if somebody was wiping DNA, they would have wiped her DNA too.
But there's also the main problem is why wasn't Adam's DNA found? So that shows that the investigation could have been flawed because maybe their collection method wasn't good enough. We know he touched the knife and held the knife to cut the rope. And we know that he touched the rope. And we know that he had his mouth on her mouth, if he's telling the truth. So did they not look in the right place? Because they didn't find it at all. They left the knife in the sun, so it could have been on the knife, but degraded in the sun. These are some of the unanswered questions. The investigators were called to the stand, and they just said, well, it's fragile, and DNA, you think you're going to see it, and it's not there, because if the person just washed their hands or took a shower right beforehand, they may not have, whatever, the oil on their hands to deposit it on that item that we can then find in a test. And he had just taken a shower that morning. We don't know.
That's exactly it. We don't know.
They made a big point of that, though. That's why the Zahau's attorney, Keith Greer, was saying this was wiped down because there's 12 places that his expert said there should have been DNA found where there was no DNA found. So, yeah, there you go. We don't know. There's one good point that I thought someone made, and this was not in court. This was on an Oxygen show, that they used a Q-tip to collect DNA, and they only used one for a whole door. When I heard that, I'm like, oh, wow. So basically, he explained that your swab gets saturated quickly if it's a big surface, but a small swab. So why not use more than one swab? If somebody's touching different parts of the door, maybe if you used 2 Q-tips or 5 Q-tips, maybe you would have found another source of DNA. Do you see what I mean? He said the collection methods were flawed as well because they did things like that. I learned a lot from investigating this case.
This is my opinion only. Okay. I don't think there's enough evidence that Rebecca committed suicide. But the police conclusion was that she was grief-stricken because of Max's accident and his death. But at the time, he was still alive.
Right.
And her history shows she really wouldn't have picked such a public way to kill herself.
Right. I'm not taking a position either way in terms of whether this was a suicide or a murder. Honestly, I went back and forth many times during my investigation of this case. But I do think there is evidence that she committed suicide. I also think there is evidence, or at least enough unanswered questions, that cannot be explained by suicide, that it needs more investigation. And there's a lot of things that just don't make sense if it's a suicide, that it looks more like a murder. So I can see both sides of this. I just want to get that on the record. But I do believe that there is evidence that she committed suicide, although I can't say for sure that she did, and I can't say for sure that she was murdered. So she was a troubled person, though. And I think her family did not know her as well as they think that they did. I did 8 lengthy interviews with Jonah Shacknai, her boyfriend, and he had not talked to anybody else except a real brief interview with 2020. He lived with her and was her boyfriend for over 2 years. He didn't really know her as well as he thought he did either. It turns out that she was telling different stories to everybody. She was a troubled person. My investigation interviewed one of her old boyfriends, Michael Berger, who she was with while she was married. She told him all kinds of stories, that she was getting divorced, that she was separated from her husband, that she wanted to be with him and not with her husband. And then one day she disappears, and then she calls him and she's crying, and she says she's, over the course of a couple days, she keeps calling and saying, I can't see you anymore, but I've been taken. They've got me blindfolded and they're driving me around in this car, blah, blah, blah. And then she comes back. And then she disappears again, and he never sees her after that. And she's off in Oregon. And it turns out she's back with her husband, but she never tells Michael that. So she has a history of telling people different stories. She's not who she really appears to be. And she just seemed like a really troubled person that was trying to please people and didn't want to hurt people and couldn't make decisions. She just seemed sad to me. And I don't think her family really saw her that way. They saw her as always happy and exercising and positive. There were these notes left on her phone that she wrote that showed us how angry she was at Jonah, how she didn't feel that he had supported her. They were having a lot of problems because his teenage kids were being rude to her, disrespectful to her, and he wasn't sticking up for her. That's how she felt. She was angry about it. My husband committed suicide. He hung himself, and I know what he was like in the days before. I know that because he was diagnosed and I was with him. Rebecca had never been diagnosed with any mental health issues. She showed them a side of her that Jonah didn't see. She showed a different side of her to Jonah than she did to her family. So I think she presented herself differently to different people. So I do think there is some evidence. The question is, though, why would she do it like this, right? If it's suicide like this, that's the thing. But he murdered her. Why would they call so much attention to themselves? Why would they murder her in this way? So that's what's always baffled me. Either way, it still doesn't make sense. That's why it's such a crazy case.
The one piece of evidence, I can't get it out of my head, is the fact that she put the rope over top of her hair. I have long hair. It's a knee-jerk thing. You pull your hair out of whatever.
Yeah.
Why? The thing that gives me pause.
And why would she be naked? I mean, she was proud of her body, according to Jonah. She was always showing off her body, whatever she wore, tight clothes, midriff showing. She was very athletic. She was very obsessed with her body and how she looked. Let's put it this way. I think there are things that people aren't admitting to. Why would she be tied up like that? Suicide or murder? Why would she be tied up like that? Yeah. So we don't know. But either somebody did that to her for a reason, or she did it to herself for a reason. Those were pretty intricate knots. The sheriff's department says they weren't. The defense team was trying to say it wasn't. But even Adam said, I couldn't tie a knot like that. I don't know what kind of knot that was. So he thinks it was shibari, which is this Japanese erotic self-tying sexual thing. How would she know how much rope would get her that far off the ground? I mean, there's just all these questions that I have that, yes, there's evidence of suicide, but there's also a lot of unanswered questions.
And her center of gravity, how would she have thrown herself off the balcony?
Right. And the sheriff's department says there are these clear prints on the balcony. No, other people say, no, they're not clear. And in fact, it seems like there's only a toe. How are you going to get all your weight to throw yourself over that balcony with just being on your toe, on one toe? So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why suicide doesn't make sense as well. So I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying it was a suicide. I'm not. Yeah. I'm saying there's evidence showing both.
Unexplained death.
I think it would have been great if they did more investigation and if they had asked other questions that they didn't ask.
Another part that makes you have to stop and think is the door. She's only 5'3", but the note was much higher. I know it's paint, so it's not necessarily what your handwriting would look at, but did they ever look at that as far as could it match how she would have written?
There's a lot of questions in this one. So there was a message on the door. She saved him. Can you save her? Okay. It was in 2 separate lines. It was all capital letters. According to the sheriff's handwriting person, he says, I couldn't even do a comparison because, number one, it's painted, not written. So it's a paintbrush, not someone holding a pen on a piece of paper. And so there's no way to do a comparison because that's just not scientific. So they just didn't even try. That's what the guy basically said on the stand. So the Zahau family had a guy who the defense team spent like an entire day with the jury not present, trying to keep him out of the courtroom from testifying. He basically said he looked at signatures and whatever writing he could get, and he thought it was more likely that Adam wrote it than Rebecca, but it was very couched. He couldn't say for sure. More likely. And that is the standard in a civil court. Okay, so it's like 51% pointing to one person versus 49. You could say it's more likely that Adam did it than Rebecca. He didn't give us any numbers, but that's the standard. In criminal court, it's a much higher standard, and it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's the same for the jury. Anyway, he basically said he looked at the A's and he looked at the M's, and he thought that those letters were more like Adam's than Rebecca, because Adam signs his name using capital letters. He prints his signature in capital letters, which I thought was an odd coincidence.
It's just a weird case.
But you said the height thing. Okay, so according to the defense's expert, it was too high for Rebecca to do that comfortably. However, in the courtroom, the defense attorney tried to call one of his employees to come and do a demonstration, and the judge yelled at him, and you can't do that. It's not a witness. You can't have somebody come and do that. Months later, after the verdict came in, finding Adam responsible, the sheriff did a review because he was in the middle of a re-election campaign. And his opponent said, if I were elected sheriff, I would reopen this as a criminal case. Because of that, the sheriff said, we'll do a review of our investigation. So they didn't interview anybody or anybody new. They didn't really do much, frankly, but they supposedly went back and read through the trial transcripts and listened for whatever theories were presented, but they ended up 9 months later sticking to the exact same position they had. But during the press conference, which I was told I could come to, and then I was told I couldn't come to because I had no press pass, which I thought was absurd. But anyway, during the news conference, one of the detectives basically said that he didn't think that it was too high, somebody that height to write it. So there you go. When it's sitting on the ground, it's one thing, and it's actually in the frame, it's a little higher. It's mounted on the actual door frame in the hinges, and it goes up a little higher. It's a question of whether you're just standing the door on the floor and somebody tries to write on it, or who knows. According to the Zahaus, you have to be somewhere between, I think it was 5'10" and 6 feet, the person who would write that comfortably, and Adam is 5'11", and Rebecca's 5'4", I think.
We could talk to you about this case all day. I think we need to learn a little bit about you. We're going to switch gears here.
Okay.
Can you tell us about your memoir, Secret Lives and Shoelaces?
Secrets, Lies, and Shoelaces. I wrote that over a 19-year period. It took me a long time because it was very difficult to write. It was about my marriage, my relationship with my late husband, who hung himself in a motel room in Mexico. My editor at Kensington Citadel Press, which is the publisher of this book. I've done 6 books before this one with the same publisher. I've never done this before, but she wanted me to basically put myself into this story because I have this unique perspective, because my husband did commit suicide by hanging, and we know for sure that he did that. There was no question. And in fact, I was expecting it. I looked at this case through the lens of my own personal experience and my own personal knowledge of what somebody acts like and behaves like, says and does before they hang themselves. Rebecca did show some troubling signs. She shoplifted early on before she met Jonah. She was arrested and she did a plea bargain, and she lied to people. She lied to her family. She lied to Jonah. She lied to her ex-husband. She lied to her ex-boyfriend. So she had a number and so did my husband. Very coincidentally, my husband also was arrested for shoplifting while he was in Phoenix, and they went through the very same diversion program. Now, my husband was an alcoholic, and he was in a blackout, and he was the chief investment officer for